Welcome to Lost at 3 a.m. Put your phone down, close your eyes, and let this be the last video you hear tonight. Relax, breathe, and let's begin. Tonight, we take a trip back to the awkward, hilarious, and painfully relatable world of the Inbetweeners, a show that perfectly captured the cringe, chaos, and confusion of teenage life. Few comedies have ever nailed the awkwardness of adolescence quite like this one. It wasn't about cool kids or epic coming-of-age moments. It was about the middle ground, the in-between, where school isn't a Hollywood dream. Romance is a series of humiliations, and your best friends are also your biggest sources of embarrassment. From schoolyard insults and disastrous dates to ridiculous lies and tragic holiday experiences, the Inbetweeners wasn't afraid to embrace the ugly truth of growing up. It wasn't just a comedy, it was a time capsule of teenage life, packed with moments so real and cringeworthy that you almost feel secondhand embarrassment just watching it. Over the next few minutes, we'll explore how this legendary show came to be, the characters that made it so unforgettable, its most iconic moments, and why it remains one of the most beloved British comedies of all time. So picture yourself standing outside a sixth form common room, surrounded by your mates, trying and failing to act cooler than you are. That's the world of the Inbetweeners. Let's dive in. Before the Inbetweeners became one of the most iconic British comedies, it started as a simple idea, one that aimed to capture the raw, unfiltered awkwardness of teenage life in a way that felt real. Created by Damon Beasley and Ian Morris, the show was inspired by their own school experiences. The moments that weren't dramatic or cinematic, but painfully mundane, embarrassing, and ridiculous. They wanted to show what being a teenager was really like, not the romanticized Hollywood version, but the cringe-inducing reality, where friendships are based on insults, social status is a constant struggle, and every attempt at impressing someone ends in disaster. At first, the Inbetweeners wasn't an easy sell. British TV was flooded with glossy, high-energy teen dramas like Skins, which focused on parties, rebellion, and intense relationships. The Inbetweeners was the exact opposite, a show about four painfully average lads, completely clueless about life, love, and everything in between. Eventually, E4, known for taking risks on fresh, edgy content, picked it up. When it aired in 2008, nobody expected it to become a cultural phenomenon. But almost overnight, the show connected with audiences in a way few sitcoms ever have. Unlike other teen shows, The Inbetweeners wasn't trying to be aspirational. It didn't have cool characters, dramatic storylines, or unrealistic teenage fantasy moments. It was awkward, gross, and brutally honest, and that's exactly why people loved it. It wasn't just a sitcom, it was a mirror of every embarrassing school memory we'd all rather forget. And from that moment on, the Inbetweeners became something far bigger than anyone expected. At the heart of the Inbetweeners are four of the most awkward, clueless, and brilliantly written characters in British comedy history. Each one represents a different kind of teenage disaster, making them both hilariously dysfunctional and painfully relatable. First, there's Will Mackenzie, the posh, socially awkward outsider who arrives at Rudge Park Comprehensive after being forced out of private school. Dressed in a blazer, carrying a briefcase, and constantly correcting everyone, Will is the nerd who thinks he's above everyone else, until reality repeatedly humbles him. Whether it's getting bullied, rejected, or embarrassing himself in front of entire crowds, Will somehow always finds himself in the worst possible situations. And yet, his dry sarcasm and brutal honesty make him the voice of reason, or at least the closest thing this group has to one. Then there's Simon Cooper, the hopeless romantic, permanently in a state of emotional crisis over his longtime crush, Carly D'Amato. No matter what happens, Simon cannot function normally around her. Whether it's crashing his car into her front garden, or turning up to a fashion show looking like an idiot, his every attempt to impress her ends in disaster. Simon is the most normal of the group, but that's not saying much. Because normal teenage boys are still embarrassing, desperate, and constantly making terrible choices. Next, we have Jay Cartwright, the pathological liar, the king of exaggeration, and the human embodiment of teenage bravado. According to Jay, he has a massive house, a nightclub-owning dad, and an endless list of sexual conquests. In reality, he's just a sexually frustrated, insecure teenager who makes up wild stories to seem cooler than he is. His confidence is both impressive and completely unfounded, and watching his lies fall apart is one of the greatest joys of the show. And finally, there's Neil Sutherland, the lovable idiot. He's clueless but happy, gullible but easygoing, and somehow manages to live in a bubble of blissful ignorance. Unlike the rest of the group, Neil doesn't overthink things, he just goes with the flow. Whether he's dancing like a lunatic, misunderstanding basic concepts, or unknowingly making hilarious double entendres, Neil is the purest, most effortlessly funny member of the group. Together, these four create the perfect storm of teenage awkwardness. They are not the cool kids, the rebels, or the outcasts. They are simply in between, struggling their way through life one disaster at a time. And that's exactly why we love them. What makes the Inbetweeners so uniquely hilarious? It isn't flashy punchlines, big budget set pieces, or carefully crafted sitcom formulas. The humor comes from something far more relatable and painful, pure, unfiltered teenage embarrassment. At its core, The Inbetweeners is a show about failure. Every episode is built on the awkward, cringe-worthy moments that define adolescence. Failed relationships, social disasters, humiliating misunderstandings, and brutally honest schoolyard insults. There's no glamour, no happy endings, just four teenage boys fumbling their way through life, making fools of themselves at every turn. A big part of the show's brilliance is its brutal realism. Unlike Hollywood teen comedies, where the nerdy kid somehow ends up with the girl, or the underdogs pull off some miraculous social victory, The Inbetweeners offers no such fantasy. Every attempt at romance, rebellion, or status-seeking ends in complete disaster, and that's exactly why it resonates so much. The dialogue is another standout. The schoolyard banter feels so raw and real, filled with quick insults, exaggerated stories, and moments of absolute stupidity. The boys don't support or uplift each other. They take every opportunity to tear each other down, in the way only teenage best friends can. From Jay's ridiculous lies to Will's relentless sarcasm, the show perfectly captures how teenage boys actually talk. The physical comedy is equally brilliantly awkward, whether it's Simon's infamous failed striptease, Will's horrific attempts at flirting, or Neil's completely unaware dance moves. The Inbetweeners is packed with moments that make you laugh, cringe, and cover your eyes at the same time. But perhaps the funniest thing about The Inbetweeners is how relatable it is. Everyone remembers the feeling of saying something embarrassing in front of their crush, getting caught in a lie, or having friends who constantly take the piss out of them. The show doesn't create comedy from exaggerated teenage experiences. It simply takes real ones and plays them out in the most painfully honest way possible. And that's what makes The Inbetweeners so timelessly funny. It isn't just about these four characters, it's about all of us, looking back on our teenage years and realizing just how ridiculous, tragic, and hilarious they really were. Few shows have delivered as many instantly quotable lines and painfully hilarious scenes as The Inbetweeners. Every episode offers at least one moment that burns itself into your brain, the kind of moment that makes you cringe, laugh, and wonder how these characters could possibly survive another day without socially collapsing entirely. One of the most infamous scenes in the entire series is Will's greatest humiliation, shitting himself in the middle of an exam. What starts as a mild stomachache soon turns into something much, much worse. Sitting in total silence, surrounded by his peers, Will's body betrays him in the most public way possible. The realization, the panic, the smell, it all unfolds in real time as his classmates react in absolute horror. It is the perfect storm of embarrassment. made worse by the fact that this is Will Mackenzie we're talking about. The universe never lets him off easy. Then there's Simon's attempt to impress Carly with what can only be described as the most tragically awkward dance in human history. It was supposed to be a smooth, flirtatious moment. Instead, Simon, in a tragic miscalculation of how to be seductive, transforms into a flailing, limb-thrashing disaster, his car friend dance becoming an instant symbol of what happens when confidence and reality don't quite match up. Carly's face says it all. This isn't romance. This is second-hand embarrassment in its purest form. And then there's Jay Cartwright. Jay, the legendary liar, the king of exaggeration, the master of stories that could never, ever be true. Whether it's claiming he has a mate who can kill a man with a single punch, insisting that he's had more threesomes than hot dinners, or swearing that his dad owns a nightclub in Spain, Jay never stops trying to impress. The best part, the sheer confidence with which he delivers these lies, knowing full well that his friends will immediately call him out. Watching his stories crumble in real time is almost an art form in itself. And of course, no conversation about the Inbetweeners is complete without the single most quotable insult in British TV history: bus wankers. A simple, perfectly timed, and completely unnecessary insult hurled from a moving car at unsuspecting commuters. Somehow, in that moment, the Inbetweeners captured something so stupid, so childish, and yet so painfully real that it became an instant classic. But that's just the beginning. There's Neil punching a fish to death in one of the most bizarre and unnecessary acts of marine violence ever seen on television. There's Jay getting an unwanted erection in the middle of a school fashion show. A moment so tragic it could only happen to someone who talks about sex every 5 minutes. There's Will, in a desperate attempt to prove he's not a loser, trying to flirt with Charlotte Hinchcliffe, the school's most popular girl, only to fail so spectacularly that even watching it unfold feels physically painful. And of course, there's the catastrophic boat party, where everything that could possibly go wrong does in spectacular fashion. What makes these moments so unforgettable isn't just the absurdity, it's the fact that they feel weirdly real. Everyone has had an embarrassing crush, a moment of trying too hard to look cool, a time where confidence turned into disaster in an instant. That's the genius of the Inbetweeners. It doesn't just make you laugh, it makes you remember. The kind of memories you've spent years trying to suppress, but instead of running from them, the show forces you to embrace them, to relive the awkwardness, and to realize that, in the end, all of those moments are just part of growing up. One of the reasons the Inbetweeners became such a massive hit was because it perfectly captured something that no other show had quite nailed: the absolute reality of being a British teenager. It wasn't about rebellion or coolness or glamorous high school drama. It was about the awkward, miserable, and deeply embarrassing experiences that make up the average teenage life. Everything about the Inbetweeners feels painfully familiar to anyone who grew up in the UK. The strict sixth form dress codes that force students into cheap blazers and badly knotted ties. The horrific public transport system, where school buses were a nightmare of sweat, shouting, and stray punches. The desperation to look cool, despite being completely clueless about how to actually achieve it. This wasn't a show about outsiders or misfits. It was a show about the majority, the ones who weren't cool enough to hang with the popular kids, but weren't outcasts either. They were just stuck in between, exactly as the title suggests. The way the boys interact is another thing that feels so distinctly British. Their friendships are built on insults, relentless banter, and complete lack of emotional support. If one of them has a problem, the others don't help, they make it worse. Simon humiliates himself in front of Carly. Jay will exaggerate the story to make it 10 times more embarrassing. Will gets bullied. The others will laugh before stepping in to help. Neil does something completely idiotic. He won't even realise it's stupid, and the others will make sure he never forgets it. It's brutal, but it's real. If you grew up with a group of British mates, you know that the only way to survive was to give as much as you got. Then, there's the way the show portrays parties and social life. Unlike American teen comedies, where house parties are massive, exciting, and filled with wild adventures, The Inbetweeners presents the real British house party experience. Lukewarm cans of beer, terrible music, weirdly small living rooms, and a constant, overwhelming feeling of second-hand embarrassment. The boys never quite know how to act, and every attempt at flirting, drinking, or looking cool just makes them seem even more tragic. Even their family holidays are painfully accurate. Anyone who's ever been dragged on a British family holiday knows the pain of cheap hotels, awkward social interactions, and being forced to eat at the same restaurant every night. The first Inbetweeners movie nails this perfectly. The lads aren't heading to some cinematic, life-changing trip abroad. They're going to Malia, a place where British teenagers go to embarrass themselves. And that's what makes The Inbetweeners so relatable. It doesn't exaggerate teenage life, it simply reflects it back at us in all its awkward, cringeworthy, and hilarious glory. Every insult, every mistake, every failure, it's all so real. And that's why, years later, the show still holds up. Because no matter how much times change, being a teenager will always be an absolute nightmare. Unlike many sitcoms that drag on for years, The Inbetweeners came to an end after just 3 seasons. In the world of British television, this isn't unusual. Many of the most beloved British comedies, like Fawlty Towers and The Office, kept their runs short but legendary. But why did The Inbetweeners stop when it was still at the peak of its success? The truth is simple. The creators, Damon Beasley and Ian Morris, wanted to end the show before it outstayed its welcome. They had always envisioned The Inbetweeners as a short, tightly written series that captured a specific moment in life, the chaotic, awkward years of sixth form. Stretching it beyond that risked losing what made it so special. Another major reason was that the characters were getting too old to stay believable as teenagers. By the time the 3rd season was filmed, the actors, Simon Bird, Joe Thomas, James Buckley, and Blake Harrison, were all in their mid to late 20s. No matter how much they tried to pass as awkward 17-year-olds, there was only so long they could keep the illusion going before it became painfully obvious. There was also the issue of where the story could go next. Sixth form was the perfect setting for The Inbetweeners, a time of trying too hard to be cool, failing miserably, and making mistakes that haunt you forever. But once that stage of life ends, things change. The next logical step, university, adulthood, or even jobs, wouldn't have had the same magic. The characters' lives were funny because they were trapped in a world they didn't quite understand, and moving them forward would have lost that. Ending at 3 seasons meant The Inbetweeners never declined in quality. Every episode remains sharp, funny, and painfully relatable, without filler or unnecessary storylines. The show left behind a perfect, self-contained comedy legacy, rather than running out of ideas and dragging itself past its prime. Of course, The Inbetweeners wasn't completely over. The story continued in 2 films, taking the lads on disastrous trips abroad. But the show itself, the heart of what made The Inbetweeners special, ended exactly where it needed to. And that's what makes it so great. It never became repetitive. It never tried to force more stories than it needed. It gave us 3 near-perfect seasons of unfiltered, awkward brilliance. And then, just like school itself, it was over. When The Inbetweeners ended after 3 seasons, fans were left wanting more. The show had become a massive cultural hit, and audiences weren't quite ready to say goodbye to Will, Simon, Jay, and Neil just yet. So instead of continuing the series, the creators made the bold decision to take the lads out of Rudge Park Comprehensive and into the ultimate British rite of passage, the infamous Lads' Holiday. Released in 2011, The Inbetweeners movie took the group to Malia, Crete, a location that promised cheap booze, wild parties, and the kind of legendary experiences that teenage boys dream of. Of course, in true Inbetweeners fashion, their trip was anything but legendary. From cringe-worthy dance moves and horrific sunburns to desperate flirting attempts and awkward sexual encounters, the film perfectly captured the reality of a lad's holiday, which is to say, it was an absolute disaster from start to finish. The film worked because it didn't stray from the show's original charm. The boys were still their hopeless, socially inept selves, trying to navigate a world they weren't remotely ready for. It was bigger, flashier, and set in a completely new environment, but it never lost what made the Inbetweeners so great: the painfully relatable embarrassment of growing up and getting it all completely wrong. The film was a huge success, breaking box office records and becoming one of the highest-grossing British comedies of all time. Naturally, this led to a sequel, The Inbetweeners 2, released in 2014, which took the group even further from home, this time to Australia. If the first film was about the classic lad's holiday, the second film was about the post-school gap year experience, where young Brits head off in search of adventure, only to find themselves lost, broke, and knee-deep in bad decisions. Once again, the boys proved that no matter where they go in the world, they will always be completely out of their depth. From horrifically embarrassing hostel stays to Neil drinking water straight from a bidet, the sequel delivered even bigger, more ridiculous moments, but somehow it still felt real. Despite their success, the films were always meant to be the final chapter. The creators and cast agreed that stretching the story any further wouldn't feel right. The boys had already gone as far as they could, and any attempt to keep going would feel forced. The films gave fans the closure they wanted, allowing us to see Will, Simon, Jay, and Neil on one last adventure together. And in true Inbetweeners fashion, they didn't ride off into the sunset as heroes or legends. They didn't become cool, smooth, or successful. They remained exactly as they had always been. Four hopeless, hilarious, and tragically relatable idiots, stumbling their way through life, one disaster at a time. Years after it ended, The Inbetweeners remains one of the most beloved British comedies of all time. Few shows have captured the brutal reality of teenage life with such honesty, humour, and second-hand embarrassment. But what is it that makes The Inbetweeners so timeless? One reason is its pure relatability. Unlike other teen comedies that glamorise high school life, The Inbetweeners gave us the awkward truth, the humiliations, the failed attempts at romance, the stupid decisions, and the friendships built entirely on relentless insults. Watching the show feels like reliving your own teenage years, for better or worse. It's painfully real, which is why it still resonates today. Another reason is its cultural impact. The show introduced countless catchphrases and iconic moments that are still quoted years later. Bus wankers, friend, ooh, briefcase, and completed it, mate, have become part of British pop culture, recognised even by people who weren't around when the show first aired. Then there's the way it changed British comedy. Before The Inbetweeners, most teen shows either focused on over-the-top rebellion, like Skins, or were sanitised, family-friendly versions of school life. But The Inbetweeners was different. It wasn't trying to be cool. It wasn't trying to be deep or dramatic. It was simply honest. It embraced the awkwardness, the cringe, and the failure, and in doing so, it became one of the truest representations of growing up ever put on TV. Even after all these years, the show still finds new audiences. Thanks to streaming platforms, younger generations are discovering The Inbetweeners for the first time, proving that its humour is not tied to a specific era. Sure, the flip phones and terrible fashion choices might be dated, but the experiences, the social awkwardness, the bad decisions, and the struggle to be cool when you're absolutely not, are universal. And that's why The Inbetweeners will always hold up. Because no matter how much the world changes, one thing will always be true. Being a teenager is an absolute nightmare. The Inbetweeners didn't need a big message. It didn't try to be deep or sentimental. It didn't have dramatic story arcs or grand life lessons. And that's exactly why it worked. It wasn't about growing up. It was about surviving it. For 3 seasons and 2 films, We watched Will, Simon, Jay, and Neil navigate the humiliations, failures, and catastrophes of teenage life. And we laughed because, whether we wanted to admit it or not, we saw ourselves in them. Not the cool, rebellious, effortlessly charming teenagers we sometimes pretended to be, but the awkward, clueless, overconfident messes we actually were. The Inbetweeners captured something rare: the raw, unfiltered reality of being young, the terrible house parties, the awkward first dates, the holidays that were supposed to be legendary but ended up being a disaster. It gave us some of the funniest, most cringe-worthy moments in TV history, and in doing so, it became a timeless classic. Even now, years later, people still quote it, they still rewatch it, they still laugh at how painfully real it all feels. Because no matter how much time passes, one truth will always remain: everyone, at some point in their life, has been an in-betweener. Thank you for spending your night with Lost at 3 a.m. Sweet dreams, and we'll see you next time.